Hello, welcome to Books in the World. My name is Richard Bodertha, and I'll be your host today. Our guest is Gil Newton. He's a biologist here on Cape Cod, and he's written a series of books about the habitat on Cape Cod and the animals and different organisms, as well as the wildflowers and the plant life here on the Cape. Gil, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Gil, could you give us a little background about yourself? I know you studied to be a marine biologist initially at Florida State University. At least that's where you got your graduate degree.
Correct.
But as a young boy growing up, how did you get your start in this field?
Well, that's pretty easy when you grow up on Cape Cod, as I did many years ago.
Yeah.
I was always told, go out and explore the woods and the beaches and the environment on your own. And when I did, I started becoming very interested in the world around me. And I wanted to learn more about what I was seeing. And you know, when you see something that's unknown, the first thing you want to know is what's its name. And so a lot of that was just my own interest from experiencing these wonderful habitats we have on Cape Cod.
Well, your latest book here is called Marine Habitats of Cape Cod. Now, this is the latest one in a series of 5 or 6 books that you've written.
That's right.
And I believe you're from the Cotuit area, and you have there's a special place in your heart for a place called Crocker Neck.
That's true.
And I imagine when you were a young boy, that's where you spent a lot of your time?
Yes, I did. I remember walking down to Crocker Neck and exploring the salt marsh. And fortunately, I was in a position many years later as the chairman of the Barnstable Conservation Commission to help protect that area and turn it into conservation land for the town of Barnstable.
And I believe you were also a co-founder of the Barnstable Land Trust.
Yeah, part of what we wanted to do back in the mid-1980s was to establish a private organization that would acquire open space for protection. And so I and about, I believe, 7 other people got together in the library of Marston's Mills, and we came up with this new organization, which today has their headquarters in West Barnstable, now protects over 1,000 acres of land. So I'm very pleased with how it's evolved over the years.
I should mention that all the proceeds from this book you donate to the Barnstable Land Trust.
All of the profits from a couple of the books go to the Barnstable Land Trust, correct?
Right, right. Now, when we were talking earlier, you said that one of the principal things as far as preserving the Cape was a federal park. Now, can you give us a little bit of background about that? Where it begins and where it ends and what it entails? And
well, I think one of the best things that ever happened to Cape Cod occurred back in the early 1960s when President Kennedy formed the Cape Cod National Seashore. And there's over 44,000 acres of land that preserves many different habitats of the Cape in its natural state. It's a well-managed parcel. It attracts millions of visitors every year. And one really is sort of frightened to think what the Cape might be like had we not done that. So I consider that one of the jewels of this area. And one of the reasons I moved back to Cape Cod was because of the National Seashore.
Right. Now, the Wetlands Act, when did that come about?
The 1972 Wetlands Act of Massachusetts was actually one of the first wetland protection laws in the United States. And it protects all wetlands, both freshwater and coastal wetlands, so that any kind of activity within 100 feet of a wetland falls into one of these resource areas, and a local conservation commission develops an order of conditions for that work. So that sort of protection was essential for saving many of our wetland systems that we have in the Cape, and we have many of them.
Now, the wetland system, how does that factor into our marine ecosystem?
Well, really, I tell my students all habitats on Cape Cod are coastal habitats. It means that you're never really that far from the ocean. And because we have a single source aquifer on the Cape, all of our freshwater drinking water comes from the same source. Well, this is strongly influenced by the ocean, and it in turn influences the ocean. So anything we put on the ground or anything that gets into the groundwater makes its way to the bays and estuaries and can create some contamination problems. And we all know, because we live by the coastline, how the ocean can affect where we live, whether it's coastal erosion or storm damage. And that's why we need to protect these wetland systems and these open space areas, because they act like a cushion, or like a barrier to some of the effects of the open ocean.
I see. What are some of the other habitats besides the wetlands area?
Well, the things I sort of divided them up into different aspects. So I talk about, for example, salt marsh communities. And salt marshes are very critical to support a lot of the commercial shellfish, finfish that we have in the Cape. They act as, like I said earlier, barriers from coastal storms. With global warming and increased storm activity and greater rates of erosion, those systems become even more important. We also now know the salt marshes are much more effective at absorbing carbon dioxide gas, one of the important greenhouse gases, than forest systems are. And they also support a large number of species that may visit the marsh or lay their eggs in the marsh or seek shelter or hide from predators, whatever the case may be. They're very important. Another system are sand dune communities, because they also act as erosion control areas that are well vegetated and help protect our upland region. But there are literally a lot of different habitats here in Cape Cod, and that's what makes it one of the most interesting places to study.
What is some of the vegetation that will protect the sand dunes or the?
There are a lot of plants on sand dunes that are very important. The most obvious one is the beach grass. And many communities have actually planted beach grass as erosion control. But we shouldn't just plant a monoculture on a dune system. In order to protect the dune system, we have to maintain a diversity of species. So we also have things like dusty miller and Rosa rugosa, which also is a good wildlife plant. There are other things too, things like dusty miller I mentioned earlier, wormwood, which is related to that. There's beach pea. There's really quite a few different species that help protect the dune system.
Right. How about tide pools? Is that another
Tide pools are
habitat?
also very interesting marine habitats. They have a rather unique assemblage of plants and animals associated with them. They have to be able to adapt to local physical changes that can take place, such as excessive evaporation in the summer, increased salinity. But if you were able to explore a tide pool, such as the ones off Horizons Beach in Sandwich at low tide, you see a huge diversity of animals, including starfish, sea anemones, many other common animals here. So they're a lot of fun to explore, especially with students.
Right. Jetties, how do they factor into protection of the, sometimes they're not good at protection. They
That's
actually
right.
create a reverse effect.
That's right. Jetties have both their pros and cons.
Right.
Jetties cause erosion. And they cause erosion because what they do is they tend to focus wave energy on a more narrow area of the beach. And so wherever you have a lot of jetties and groins, seawalls and what have you, you're going to see increased erosion. Having said that, though, jetties also are places of attachment for a lot of species. So they could be areas where a large number of fish might be attracted to. There's all kinds of seaweeds and barnacles and other animals that find their homes along jetties. So they become like a habitat for a number of species, but at the same time they have a big impact on the coastline.
Right. Explain the difference between, or maybe there's not a difference, I don't know, seaweed and algae. Is algae a part of the seaweed class?
Algae is the large group that includes the seaweeds. The seaweeds are usually the macroalgae, the large ones that you can see when you go down to the beach.
Yeah.
Algae also include a very important group of organisms called phytoplankton, which are microalgae. And phytoplankton are extremely important because they basically kickstart the food web for the ocean by transferring sun energy into usable energy that gets passed all the way up the food web. It supports all the way up to the fish and the large whales. But from our point of view, the microalgae of the ocean also are the major oxygen producers on this planet. And therefore, we should all have bumper stickers that say, "Have you thanked a diatom today?" Because they're really that important. The seaweeds are just as important in one sense, is that they are being widely used for a lot of purposes today. They're very diverse, and they, even though they're found in more shallow areas and not necessarily on the open ocean, there's still a lot of animals that depend upon them. So my research area with the seaweeds, I always loved the macroalgae, and that was one of those things where we went down to the beach and go, look at all these different kinds of seaweeds, I wonder what they are.
Right.
And the more I studied them, the more I learned about them, the more I came to enjoy them.
You're quite involved in education. Not only were you a teacher, but now you're continuing.
That's correct.
At 4Cs at the Cape Cod Community College.
Yep.
You teach marine biology there, I believe.
Yeah, I teach coastal ecology and coastal zone management at Cape Cod Community College, and I've been doing that since the 1980s.
What's your principal topic, or what's your principal focus with the young people?
I think my principal focus is for them to develop what I call an ecological eye. That is, when they go down to these different habitats, these different systems, and I take the classes to them, that they start to look at things from a different perspective. Not just see things, but to actually
You bring
observe.
them down to the
I bring them to all these different
outside.
habitats.
You're a big believer in the outside
Absolutely.
education.
Yeah,
Right.
all of my classes have an outdoor component when I was teaching at the high school or the college level or any other level.
Yeah.
And if they can start to develop an appreciation for what they see, an understanding of how fragile, sensitive, but also how beautiful and diverse these systems really are, that's my major goal. Meantime, I'm also sneaking in a lot of science. So they're learning a lot of the details about the plants and animals and their relationships.
Yes. You mentioned in one of your introductions here, Rachel Carson, and the sea around us, the edge of the sea.
My favorite book.
Can you tell us a little bit of the impact that she had on you and the direction that you took?
Yeah, when I was growing up, there really wasn't a lot of material available for young people. However, Rachel Carson was writing her books about the ocean, as well as Jacques Cousteau, who was also doing the same thing and putting on his programs on television. The combination of those two, as well as my own personal experiences here growing up on the Cape, was a major influence on my thinking. What I loved about Rachel Carson was she was a trained biologist, but she also was an outstanding writer. And that the combining of those two talents made her very unique. And to this day, her book, The Edge of the Sea, is my favorite.
I see.
Yeah.
And Jacques Cousteau, I mean, people our age remember him on
Yes, we
TV,
do.
but what did he write that really got you enthused about the marine life?
A lot of his books are about the deeper parts of the ocean.
I see.
And because he developed scuba gear, he was also one of the first people to actually explore and take the photography that show these amazing sights around the world. And I wanted to do that too when I was watching these.
Well, you went to Woods Hole. You did when you were in graduate school, you
That's
did
correct.
some time at Woods Hole.
Yeah, I worked for the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, basically doing whatever they asked me to do, helping scientists in their labs, collecting specimens. But I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of the researchers in their fields, and they were very generous with their time, sharing their knowledge and experiences with me. I was like a sponge, just taking it all in. And I found that one of the best experiences I ever had was my few years working there.
I see. And then you came up here back home, and you began your teaching career.
Right.
And I believe you taught for 38 years or 36 years there at Sandwich.
Yes.
And you founded a program called the STEM program. Can you elaborate on that a little
A
bit?
few years ago, we decided, the then Superintendent Dr. Canfield decided to move all of the 7th and 8th graders who were then in 3 K through 8 buildings, move them to the A wing of the high school, and to create a whole new program for all 7th and 8th graders that we call the STEM Academy. Now, nationally, STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. And we wanted to incorporate this need that our country has right now into the middle school. But we also wanted for those students who were interested in the arts and humanities to provide many opportunities for them. So we renamed it Strategies That Engage Minds. Dr. Canfield asked me to be the director and to put the program together, which we did. And so all of the classes in the STEM Academy use project-based learning as their mode of operation. All the teachers were trained, and that's how they do it. So our kids were able to take classes on space exploration, and everybody takes engineering, and everybody has art, and at the same time having all their basic skills taught as well. So I did that for several years before I retired in June. It was one of the best experiences I ever had. I was very pleased that superintendent gave me that opportunity. I love the middle school age. I think they're fun to teach, and it was certainly one of a great opportunity for me.
Right. Now, some of the organisms that we have here on the Cape are known to people in the medical field. Organisms here on the Cape have all sorts of uses, but the horseshoe crab, for instance.
Yeah, very important one.
And can you explain a little bit about a horseshoe crab? I mean, we've seen them. We don't see them quite as much as we used to.
That's right.
They look like they're out of the dinosaur age, which they very well might be. I don't know.
They're actually before the dinosaur age.
Is that right?
They've been on
but
the earth.
oddly, they're not even really a crab.
No, they're not. They're not true crabs. They're in their own class, more closely related to spiders and scorpions. They also, one of the ways you know they're not true crab is that horseshoe crabs, when they molt from the head, whereas true crabs molt from the rear. But horseshoe crabs are unique, as you just suggested, from medical terms, because they have in their blood, which is blue, substances that basically will lyse bacteria when they become exposed to it. So these bacterial endotoxins...
They'll clot? Will they
it
clot?
basically clots, and so that the animal isn't getting sick, which could help explain why it has survived as many years as it has, because the ocean's filled with bacteria. So we use that blood to test for the presence of bacterial endotoxins in medical equipment and supplies. And that helps prevent people from coming down with secondary infections, for example, if they've recently had an operation and they're in the hospital and their immune system has been depressed, they're less likely to pick up such a disease. In addition to that, the shell of horseshoe crabs, which is made of a chitin, has been used in sutures. Their compound eyes have been studied by scientists, and hopefully we'll be able to treat, if not actually cure, some forms of eye disease, even blindness in some cases. And that's not unusual for us to use marine animals and plants to find substances that will help us fight disease and infections. But the horseshoe crab is very unique. Its blood is blue because it has copper in its hemoglobin instead of iron. And they extract some of the blood from the animal, and then they put the animals in holding tanks for a few days, let them recover, and then release them back into the environment after they've been marked so they don't get recollected for that. So they don't destroy the animals in the process. You had mentioned that horseshoe crabs are not seen as often as they used to, and I agree with you in that. I remember seeing them much more commonly than I do today. Not that they're an endangered species, but there's no question that numbers have dropped a bit. And that has had an impact on some migratory bird species like the red knot, which feeds on a lot of their eggs. So their numbers are dropping too. No one really knows, as far as I know, nobody really knows the cause of that. There's a lot of speculation that maybe the lysate industry is having an impact. Again,
what is the lysate?
That's where they take
medical,
the blood, the medical
yeah,
part.
right.
But there's really little evidence for that. Lobstermen can take them for bait, so that might have an impact too. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I suspect that the horseshoe crab is like an environmental indicator. It's telling us something about the ocean. I know our waters are warmer. 2017 was the warmest year in record for the ocean. And I don't want to blame everything on climate change. I think that can be a mistake. But we are seeing some differences in populations of some seaweeds and some animals too, where we didn't see them before in colder months, or we see less of them. And to me, that's a sign. It's the old canary in a coal mine. Right. What's going on here? So I guess the standard answer is more research needs to be done. And I'm sure there are scientists out there that are doing just that. But we have to be cautious. It would be a shame to lose this animal, not only because of its medical importance, but the animal's been on the earth so long, and it really is a remarkable creature. It would be a real shame if we were to lose it.
Go into some of the other organisms here that we have. I know we have several species of crabs, the fiddler crab, the green crab. Go into that a little bit.
Well, there's a lot of species of crabs, and some of them are commercially important, like the blue crab. My favorite is the fiddler crab in the salt marshes.
Is that the one we see with the...
Yeah, you see them, the little
tentacles
houses.
Always...
Yeah, they have... Well, the males are the ones with the large claw.
Yeah.
And the male uses that for courtship display and for defense. But what I like about them is that they have a very important ecological role in a salt marsh. They literally exist by the thousands in some marsh systems, like Crockett, and they tend to aerate the marsh when they dig the little holes, and they also fertilize the marsh with their wastes. And they're also a food source for animals. Even some terrestrial animals like raccoons might come down to the marsh to feed on them. So they're a very important crustacean in a salt marsh ecosystem. The green crab is actually an invasive species and can be a real big problem on agricultural shellfish areas. Particularly up in Maine, I understand that's a real serious problem. We have a lot of invasive species. We have a new one called the Asian shore crab, which is also becoming quite abundant and is highly invasive as well. The spider crab is another favorite of mine. It's a harmless crab. Its ability to camouflage itself is remarkable, and it has the ability to kind of glue objects on its carapace, on its back, so that increases its camouflage ability. So that's pretty interesting. And there's several others too. We have rock crabs and lady crabs and many others on here.
You mentioned preservation. I know that's a real big focus of your work. How has mankind done with preservation of late? I know there's been certain things on a global level that we've done, like maybe changing the shipping lanes not to injure the right whale, to steer away from their migrating pattern. What have we done here on the Cape, though? Or how are we doing?
Well, overall, I'm always optimistic. I'm optimistic because we know more than we used to. We have a lot of laws and regulations in effect and in place that review any kind of activities that we have on the Cape. When I was growing up, they didn't exist at all. I would say, though, if I had to select the one thing that we've done on Cape Cod, in all of the towns on the Cape that has been most beneficial has been the preservation of open space. Whether it's a small parcel here and there or a large area or any kind of contiguous land, whether it's a forest system or a edge around a pond, whatever it is, whenever we've been able to protect these open space areas, that has enhanced our ability to protect our water supply, our coastal resources, and any endangered plant or animal species we may have. So about a third of the Cape is protected in that way. And it's amazing when you go into each town, you can find these conservation areas. There are beautiful trails to walk around. There are land trusts in most towns that are working diligently to preserve and manage these parcels. We mentioned the National Seashore earlier, which is a federal installation, a lot of state parks and so forth. These green oases that we have are absolutely essential. And it's really important to protect as much contiguous space and not just small fragmented areas too. We have seen a lot of changes in the wildlife on Cape Cod. When I was growing up, for example, there were no wild turkeys. Now you see them everywhere. And there were no deer ticks. And now there's a real serious problem here on the Cape.
They're mostly found, well, they're all around the Cape, but the sand dunes, I think you mentioned, to stay kind of...
Yeah, you want to stay out of the tall grasses. Sand dune communities, or the beach grass I was mentioning earlier, is a habitat because they found a lot of mice, which are carriers for the tick. And no matter where you go on the Cape, it's just one of those things you have to check. Yep. I tell my students, though, you have to look out for two things here. You got to watch out for ticks and you got to watch out for poison ivy. But where I did my research in Florida, I had to watch out for alligators and water moccasins and copperheads, and that seemed to be a little bit more challenging. So, ticks can be a real serious problem, and you have to take it seriously on the Cape.
Sure. Let's take a look at some of your books here. Of course, we have The Marine Habitats of Cape Cod, which is your most recent, 2017. And then we have your very first one, I believe, Seaweeds of Cape Cod Shores, a field guide. This was your first one. Also, while we're talking about your books, can you get into your publishing history or who they're published by?
All of my books are published by the West Barnstable Press, and the publisher and editor is Nancy Shoemaker. And she and I have worked very well together in putting together this series, and hopefully we'll have a few more in the future. She was recommended to me by one of my college students, and we got to know each other, and she does a wonderful job in editing and in putting together these these books with me.
Well, the photographs are in here are lovely.
I have to give the credit for that to a friend of mine named Chris Dumas.
Yeah.
Chris is a teacher at Sandwich High School, and a friend of mine, he's an earth science teacher, and he does the photography for at least the last 4 books, and again, Chris and I are planning on doing some more together as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, yep. Now, the the Barnstable Land Trust, are most of the Cape towns as fortunate as Barnstable to have a land trust like that?
Yeah, actually, I think a lot of towns do, and there's even a consortium of Cape Cod trusts where they're all members of that. When we first started this, we actually spoke with some people on Nantucket, which had a trust for many years. But the advantage of a private land trust over, say, a town government purchasing it is that they can do things privately. A lot of people would rather deal with a private entity as opposed to a government agency. And so back in the mid-1980s, we had our open space plan for the town government, but we also decided to start a private trust as well. Again, land trusts are a very important part of the Cape. You had asked me what's one of the most important things we've done. The establishment of the land trust, I think, is certainly up there.
But even the finer details are kind of specific and very enlightening. For instance, I think some of the boardwalks that are made, the boards have to be spaced a certain distance apart. There's got to be a gap.
There has to be a gap to allow sunlight to get down to whatever the resource area they're going over, like a dune, so that the plant life underneath can photosynthesize and grow and not erode.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Where can people pick up your books?
My books are available in most of the independent bookstores here on Cape Cod, from Provincetown to Woods Hole. And also they're online on Amazon and directly from the Barnstable Land Trust.
Well, it was a great interview, and I thank you very much for coming in. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much, Gil.
Thank you.
Yeah.